All right. Good morning. I want to spend some time talking about servanthood this morning. And usually the first thing that comes to mind when you start talking about servanthood in the Bible is Jesus washing his disciples' feet. And I don't know if you are aware, but there's actually only one of the four Gospels that actually include the account of Jesus washing a disciples' feet. Anybody know which Gospel that's in? Gospel of John. And I wonder if I don't know if this has anything to do with it, why you find it in the Gospel of John, if it didn't have something to do with what we know about John. John, along with his brother, was known as what? Sons of thunder. And they were the ones that wanted to call down fire on people if they didn't accept Jesus. And they were also the ones who were ambitious, wanted to sit on his right and his left. And so as you come down to the end of Christ's ministry, I wonder how much of an impact it had to watch Jesus washing their feet. So much of an impact that John makes sure that he includes it in his gospel. Servanthood is a key feature of the Christian life. And I'm convinced that you cannot be a Christian if you're not a servant. I looked up servant, and here's how the dictionary defines the word. A servant is a person employed by another, especially to perform domestic duties. And some of the synonyms for servant are assistant, helper, attendant, slave, and serf. And so keep these things in mind as we continue to look at servanthood. Let's go to Philippians chapter 2. Philippians chapter 2. And this passage gives us sort of the big picture of what happened when Jesus left heaven and came to this earth. Philippians chapter 2, and we'll begin with verse 3. All right. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interest of others. In your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus, who, being in the very nature of God, did not consider equality with God a thing to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. And so the passage here says to have the same mindset as Jesus, the Messiah. And what are we talking about here? And he goes through and discusses some of these things in the text. Verse 6, we see that Jesus did not push for position. The old Bible, old translation I used to use says that Jesus did not regard equality with God a thing to be grasped. In other words, it wasn't something that he wanted to hang on to at all costs. He was equal with God, he had position, but he didn't regard that as something to be grasped. He was willing to give it up. He was equal with God, but he didn't exploit it to his own advantage. Whether it was calling up 10,000 angels when he was arrested, or whether it was in the way that he approached people with humility. You notice no one ever seemed intimidated by approaching Jesus because, I think he's too great, he's not approachable. See, even the most common of people didn't have any trouble approaching Jesus, and I think it had something to do with the way that he conducted himself with people. Notice the way Jesus came into the world and his approach to the world. He came from heaven to earth and was born into a working class family. And so he didn't come, and he wasn't raised in a palace or in a very prominent family, but he was a common man. even had a common name. Now, Jesus sounds like a very uncommon name to us today, but I don't know if you realize that among Jewish children at that time period, Jesus was as common as John or Bob or Ted or something like that. And so everything about Jesus said that he was a man of the people. And notice what Jesus even said in Matthew chapter 11. He says, "Come to me, I am meek and lowly of heart. Come to me." And we need to model ourselves after him. Turn to Matthew chapter 18. And notice the contrast between this and Jesus' disciples. Matthew chapter 18, verse 1, beginning of the chapter. And this isn't unusual. The disciples were always discussing and arguing about this. They were jockeying for position. And notice in Matthew chapter 18, the disciples came to Jesus and asked, "Who then is greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" And they wanted to know which one of them was the greatest. And notice what Jesus does. He called a little child to him, placed the child among them. And he said, "Truly I tell you, unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." And he goes on and explains exactly what he means by that. "Therefore, whoever takes the lowly position of this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me." See, unlike the rulers of the day, unlike the bigwigs of the day, the children were little people. They didn't have a status. They didn't have position. They hadn't gained it yet. And Jesus says that's exactly how you need to be. The greatest in the kingdom of heaven are the least of these. And so Jesus takes the worldly ideas of greatness and he turns them upside down. He turns them on its head. The greatest are the least. Go to Matthew chapter 23. And notice what Jesus says here. Matthew chapter 23, beginning with verse 8. Jesus says, "But you are not to be called rabbi, for you have one teacher, and you are all brothers." And by the way, I don't know if you realize rabbi was a prestigious title. People wore it with pride. If you were called rabbi, they looked up to you. And he says, don't do that. Verse 9, "Do not call anyone on earth father, for you have one Father, and he's in heaven. Nor are you to be called instructors, for you have one instructor, the Messiah. The greatest among you will be your servant. For those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted." So it took a while for the disciples to really get this, because they were always jockeying for position. They were always arguing about which one of them was the greatest. And Jesus says, don't do that. Greatness is not found in titles. Greatness is not found in position. Greatness is found in the smallest and the least of things. The greatest in the kingdom is the servant. Jesus, and that's what Jesus demonstrated himself. He came from heaven to earth. He was Lord, creator of all. He humbled himself. And who am I to think that I don't have to humble myself? And I sometimes wonder just how it looks in the eyes of God when I try to exalt myself, when I think highly of myself. I wonder how ridiculous it looks to God. And I wonder if he smiles in patience, and I thank God for his patience. Oh, little people who think they're more than they really are. You know, I remember years ago, I had a Bible study on servanthood, and we started talking about all the different ways that we can serve. And several of us started talking about giving examples of different ways that we've seen, different opportunities we've seen that we can serve, different ways that we serve, and the list kind of went on and on and on. And as I'm sitting there talking, you may be thinking of different ways that you've served as well. We also talked about the necessity of having the attitude of a servant. It's hard to be a servant if you don't have the attitude of a servant. And somebody asked the question, well, how do you know if you have arrived? How do you know if you have the attitude of a servant? And somebody immediately replied, when you're treated like one. And isn't that true? When you're treated like one. All of us truly are servants of Christ. And Jesus himself demonstrated what that looks like. Like Jesus, we need to get rid of any thoughts of greatness. We need to humble ourselves like Jesus himself did. And when we humble ourselves in the sight of the Lord, it's the Lord who will lift us up. And in order to do that, we need to empty ourselves of, self. And that's the next point here in the passage in Philippians chapter 2. It says that Jesus made himself nothing. Some Bibles say that he poured himself out, or he emptied himself and took the very nature of a servant. He poured himself out. Think about how this took shape in his life. Can you imagine? Have you ever thought about what it looked like day in and day out for Jesus as people came to him? You get caught up here, okay? You thought about what it looked like day in and day out when people came to Jesus? At one point, he went into a house, and the people came from all over the place to hear him teach. The house was crowded, and it was crowded, and the doorway was crowded around the windows, and people came and brought their friend on a pallet, and they wanted to get him to Jesus so Jesus could heal them. You've heard the story before? They couldn't get to him, and so what did they do? They went up on the roof, and they dug and cut a hole to the roof, and then lowered him down. At another point, he was walking along, and there was a guy that came to him. His name was Jairus, and he had someone that was at the point of death. He wanted Jesus to come and perform a healing. And on his way, a woman who had been bleeding for years, had a hemorrhage for years, thought, if I just kind of go up to him and I just touch the edge of his robe, then I'll be healed. And so she does that. She goes up and she touches him. She's healed immediately. And Jesus says, "Who touched me?" And one of his disciples said, "Jesus, you got all of these hundreds and thousands of people that are pushing in on you and shoving against you, and you ask, who touched you?" Can you imagine day in and day out, Jesus is surrounded by all kinds of people, and they're coming to him. They're all needy. They all want something from him. And notice what he never did. He never said anything like, "Back off, folks. Do you realize who you're talking to? You realize who this is?" He never does that. He never has his apostles screen people that come to him. Screen them and then make an appointment. He never does anything like that. The apostles did try to do that, didn't they? "Why are you bringing all these kids to Jesus?" And Jesus says, "Let the children come too." I never see Jesus complain, "I really don't want to do a miracle because, if I do a miracle, then everybody's going to come around, and everybody's going to want to see a miracle, and everybody's going to want healing, and I'm just going to be a no end to the work that I have to do that day." And that's exactly what happened, but I never see Jesus complain about that at all. And I sometimes wonder if I were in the same position, if that wouldn't be what I would do. See, the thing was, it wasn't about himself. It wasn't about himself. He poured himself out. He emptied himself. It was about reaching the people. It's never about me. Now, I remember being asked that question, and I don't remember even what we were discussing. I think I was in a board meeting, and somebody was talking about, I don't want to choose this particular theme for our children's ministry because if we do that, then they're going to want to do all of this other stuff, and I really don't want to do that. And somebody asked, "Whoever said it was about you?" It's not about me. If I'm going to follow in the footsteps of Jesus and I'm going to empty myself, it's not about me. I'm last. And we need to be reminded of that, especially when we complain, especially when things don't go our way, especially when we're focused on ourselves. Whoever said it's about me? Jesus, our Lord, our ultimate example, emptied himself, even on the cross. He was put there unjustly, and what did he do? He prayed for those who put him there because it wasn't about him. The only way you can be a servant, the only way you can truly serve someone else with a servant's heart is to empty yourself. And that brings us to the last point. He emptied himself by taking the very nature of a servant. Now, in your blank, if you're filling in the blanks on the bulletin, put in the word slave rather than servant. He came as a slave. If you're reading the New American Standard Bible, you notice it says he came as a bond servant. I looked up the word because I was kind of curious. What's the difference between a servant and a bond servant and a slave? And the word that's used here is doulos, and it's usually translated slave everywhere else. in the Bible. And the word that's used here is not diakonos. That's the word for servant. It's also the word for deacon. But the word here is slave. The key idea behind this doulos is ownership. If you are a doulos to somebody, then that means somebody owns you, and your purpose in life is to serve them, and it's not about you. And that's the word that the passage here uses for Jesus. He came, he emptied himself, and he took the very nature of a slave. It wasn't about him. His purposes came ultimately from God. His service was to God, and his service to us was part of his service to God. And as a doulos, as a slave, he was obedient to God, even to the point of death, death on a cross. Not a hero's death on the battlefield, not something that people would have been puffed up with pride about, but death on a cross. Something that potentially could have been scandalous and embarrassing to Christians. It took a while for the disciples to understand. Oh, they continued to argue about greatness. And sometimes when Jesus asked, "What are you talking about?" they were quiet. Oops, he caught us. I think maybe they understood something. But our attitude should be, like the scripture reading said this morning, not look how great I am, but it's my purpose to serve. That should be our attitude. Let's go to Mark chapter 10, verse 35. Mark 10, verse 35. James and John, the sons of Zebedee, also known as the sons of thunder, came to him. "Teacher," they said, "we want you to do for us whatever we ask." "What do you want me to do for you?" he asked. They replied, "Let one of us sit at your right and the other at your left in your glory." All right. You see their aspirations? You see their ambition? And Jesus says, you don't know what you are asking. Can you drink the cup I drink or be baptized with the baptism that I'm baptized with? We can, they answered. Jesus said to them, you will drink the cup I drink and be baptized with the baptism that I'm baptized with. See, now he's talking about his suffering here, okay? You're going to go through that too. But, he says, to sit at my right or left is not for me to grant. These places belong to those for whom they have been prepared. And when the 10 heard this, they became indignant with James and John. Okay, who do they think they are trying to elevate themselves above us? Jesus called them together and said, you know that those who are regarded as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Okay, they understood this. That's why they were jockeying for position. But he says in verse 43, not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life a ransom for many. Jesus redefines greatness. The greatest in the kingdom is the slave. You know, this is a term that was real popular probably about 10 years ago, 20 years ago. Used to hear people always talking about servant leadership. And I think part of where that comes from are passages like this. Now, those two terms seem to be contradictory, right? Servant and leadership. But leadership in the kingdom, Jesus says, is not about lording it over others. Even Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 9 says, for though I am free from all men, I have made myself a slave to all, that I might win as many as possible. And so Paul provided leadership by becoming a slave. You remember those old illustrations of leadership that used a triangle? Sometimes you see an organization, you have different people in the organization, and you have the leader at the top, and then the mid-level managers, and so on and down. I remember I used to, at one point, see that in books sometimes on church leadership, where the elders were at the top, and then the deacons, and so forth. But what really grabbed my attention is I opened up a book on servant leadership, and that triangle they had taken and they turned it upside down. The leader is at the bottom, Okay, the triangle's upside down, and his purpose is to support, to encourage, to come alongside, to motivate those people in his organization. Servant leadership takes leadership and turns that concept, the worldly concept, upside down. And this is what Jesus did in the way that he conducted himself. He modeled what servant leadership looks like. And I had to ask myself the question, would I be comfortable in applying Christ's words to myself? How many of us ever refer to ourselves as a slave of Christ? I understand maybe the negative connotation and the negative emotion associated with that word, but in fact that is the word the Bible uses. We prefer, I think, the term servant. That's a little bit more palatable, but that's not the word that the Bible uses. We are a slave of Christ, and what that means is that we belong to Him, and our purpose in life is to serve His purposes. Jesus came to serve, and He came as a slave, and who do you think I think I am if I'm too good for that? Jesus said a servant or a slave is not above his master, right? And so this is what servanthood looks like. We don't jockey for position. We don't push for position. We empty ourselves, and we serve, and it's not about us. That's exactly what Jesus did. That's what He was doing when He came from heaven to earth and died on the cross for us. His heart's desires for every single one of us to serve God and to know God. And that's why He came and died on the cross and rose up from the grave. And if you haven't accepted His rule and His lordship over your life, if you've not begun to serve Him and serve His purposes, then don't wait another day. If you believe that He rose up from the grave, and you're ready to accept His lordship over your life, and you're ready to be baptized, and you become His servant. And we need to remember that we're called not just to serve, but also to have the attitude of a servant. How can you know whether you have the attitude of a servant? When you're treated like one. I want to end with a story from... I'm behind again, aren't I? End with a story... Some of you may have heard of Dwight Moody. He was a world-renowned evangelist in the 19th century. And there was a large group of European preachers that came to one of his Northfield Bible conferences in Massachusetts in the late 1800s. And the European preachers, they followed the European custom of the time. When they got into the rooms, each of the guests put their shoes outside their room to be cleaned by the hall servants overnight. But of course this was America, and there were no hall servants in America. And so Moody walked through the dormitory halls that night. He saw the shoes, and he determined that he was not going to embarrass his European brothers. And so he mentioned the needs of some of the ministerial students who were there, but he met with only silence or pious excuses. And so Moody returned to the dorm himself. He gathered up all of those shoes, and alone in his room, the world's only famous evangelist at that time began to clean and polish the shoes. The only reason anyone ever knew that this happened is the arrival of a friend unexpectedly when he was in the middle of the process. And so when the foreign visitors opened the doors the next morning, their shoes are right there. They were shined, and they never knew by whom. Moody told no one, but his friend told a few people. And during the rest of the conference, different men volunteered to shine the shoes in secret. Perhaps this episode is a vital insight into why God used Moody the way that He did. He was a man with a servant's heart, and that was the basis of his true greatness.